So we have these lobe-finned fishes that are like using the stumpy parts of their fins to walk around in the mud, to kind of crawl around in the mud a little bit. And we think that they were the ancestors of tetrapods. Amphibians, the next thing we see, a type of tetrapod, they have lungs as adults but need water for reproduction. They've got moist skin with mucus glands, no scales, no claws. So no claws on your amphibians. If it's got claws, it's a reptile, not an amphibian. The skin's moist. The skin's a little bit slimy because they're covered in snot. It's not pleasant to think of, but that's what it is. They're kind of covered in snot to keep them moist so they don't dry out. But they have to lay their eggs in the water. They've got lungs, so they don't live in the water. They can only be in the water for about so long, but their young have to have the eggs in the water, and then they start in the water as little tadpoles or equivalent of tadpoles, where they're living in the water, eating in the water, doing all that stuff until they transition. Now, amphibians start with fishopods, and recently a large number of transitional fossils. So on that line between a lobe-finned fish in the water, being a fish, but with heavier tops to their fins, and amphibians were found, where there were these very small differences between each group, where the lobes got more pronounced, the fins got less pronounced. Eventually, you start getting what looks like little fingers for amphibian fingers on the end of them. And those are transitional fossils. Fossils where we see something that looks kind of like a fish, but kind of looks like a regular amphibian, bit by bit making that change. So closely related species where you've got a population that's speciated into being more like an amphibian, and then the whole population is a little bit more like an amphibian, and then it speciates again. That new species is a little bit more like an amphibian, more like having 4 limbs and so on. And we've just, like I said, recently unearthed a large number of transitional fossils that fit in that series of species. Now, dry scaly skin, well-developed lungs, strong limbs, shelled eggs, that would be a reptile. So reptiles, they adapt from amphibians. We see a speciation towards becoming reptiles. And first of all, their skin goes from being covered with goo to being actually dry and scaly and waterproof. So now we see this maintenance of an interior humidity, so to speak, regardless of what's going on outside around them, through the use of a waterproof skin. The lungs aren't just there, but they're very well developed. They no longer look like fish flotation devices. They look like full-on, this is a completely dedicated breathing organ, and that's it. They have strong limbs. So, one of the things you notice about most amphibians is amphibians are kind of squishy. They don't have a whole lot of power. Whereas with reptiles, you've got tyrannosaurs and you've got all these different reptiles, and basically they can dig some serious holes with their front claws. Eventually they learn to stand up on their hind claws and are able to jump with them and rake you to death and all kinds of stuff. They've got these really strong front and rear limbs. And their eggs also, over that time, species evolve to have eggs with hard shells. Shells that, once again, basically protect and keep the moisture inside, and so that it can't evaporate or leave the eggs, and that also are protective of the eggs that start out kind of leathery shelled and eventually harden, but that will take being accidentally stepped on, being bumped around, being knocked around a little bit, being left in a nest where they will survive that. So you've got these reptiles. Permian period, at the beginning of that, the earth starts to cool down. As the earth cools down, swamps, lakes dry up, and basically there's less water, there's less amphibian environment. Now there's more environment that's more conducive for something with dry, scaly skin, shelled eggs, well-developed lungs, strong limbs. And so we see reptiles adapt into all these different kinds of species fairly quickly, so that by 250 million years ago, there were a lot more